Okay, well, why don't we begin, if I can get this thing to operate, which it's not doing. There we go. Okay, so far in this course, we've talked about social cognition in general, the general processes by which we perceive and categorize the social world and encode and retrieve memories about social events and what's going on in the brain and how all of this develops. And what I want to do this week is to put these general processes in the context of personality. That is, not to talk about social cognition in general, but to talk about individual differences in personality and how they might relate to social cognition. Now, for those of you who have not had Psychology 150 or whatever our general personality course is, just by way of background, the traditional psychology of personality is dominated by two very different strains of theorizing. The first of these is a set of so-called psychodynamic theories of personality that have their origins in the work of Sigmund Freud and his followers and his successors. And they're called psychodynamic theories because they are based on the interplay and the conflicts among various kinds of motives. So, for example, Freud's own theory of personality basically argued that personality arose out of infantile sexual and aggressive impulses, which conflicted with the demands of the external physical and social environment. That conflict created anxiety, and that led to the deployment of various defense mechanisms to deal with the conflict. That is all you ever have to know about the Freudian psychoanalytic theory of personality. And then Freud was followed by a bunch of so-called neo-Freudian theorists who desexualized the process, talked about motives other than human sexuality, and also debiologized the process. Freud thought that infantile sexual and aggressive motives had their deep roots in our biology, and other neo-Freudian analysts thought that our conflicts and our anxieties and our drives, for that matter, could have sources in the external environment as well. The problem with the psychodynamic theories of personality is that they're not very good scientific theories of personality. The evidence that they're based on is largely anecdotal, derived from case material, and the data itself is subject to an awful lot of bias and filtering because it's being collected by the theorist. Freud had a theory, which he then used as a filter for interpreting what his patients told him on the analytic couch. And we hardly ever, with Freud or any of his successors, get any kind of raw, unfiltered data that we could use to construct an unbiased test. In the latter part of the 19th century and the early 20th century, another strain of personality theorizing arose, centered on the notion of the personality trait. The idea that there are personality traits like friendliness that are somehow analogous to physical traits, and that what we can do is we can figure out what those traits are and then use our understanding of individual traits to capture individual differences in personality. The best example of these, there are dozens of them in the 20th century history of psychology, is the so-called Big Five structure of personality, which I talked about before in the context of implicit personality theory, which basically says that we can capture individual differences in personality in a structure that consists of just 5 dimensions: neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. And that we can, if we know where a person stands on each of those 5 dimensions, my Big Five blind date questions, that's pretty much all we need to know about a person's personality. In contrast to the psychodynamic theories, which were really more intuitive and clinical in their origins, there's a big emphasis on standardized assessment and the so-called trait theories of personality, the development of personality inventories, personality questionnaires for assessing individual differences. But the general idea behind all these trait theories is that these personality traits, in a structure like the Big Five structure of personality, gives coherence to personality, holds all these individual differences together, renders personality and behavior stable across long and short intervals of time, renders personality and behavior consistent across a wide variety of different situations, and knowledge of a person's personality traits, where he or she stands on the Big Five, for example, allows us to predict how he or she will behave in a particular situation. If you know somebody's friendly, you can predict that he or she will smile at strangers and things like that. The psychodynamic theories of personality had their problems, and so do the trait theories of personality, not least of which it turns out that personality traits are not as coherent as the trait theories would allow us to believe. Behavior isn't as stable as trait theories would suggest it is. It's not as consistent across situations as trait theories would suggest it is. And for that matter, it's not as predictable as trait theories would suggest it is. The whole point of having a personality trait is to make your behavior coherent and consistent and stable and predictable. But it turns out that human behavior is not nearly as coherent and stable and consistent and predictable as people would have liked it to be. So what happened as the world kind of emerged out of World War II is that a third approach to personality began to emerge, which changed the focus of personality from things that are going on inside the person, Freudian drives of sex and aggression, or personality traits like extroversion or neuroticism, and put the emphasis on the context or the situation in which the person was behaving. And the background for this change, did I skip a slide? Yes, I did. Basically, the idea is to shift the focus of personality theory from the person to the situation, which you might think is a kind of weird thing to do to a personality theory, but that didn't prevent large numbers of social psychologists from doing it. And basically they said, look, we can solve the problem of the stability and the consistency and the predictability of behavior by just looking at behavior as something that the person's behavior is something that's responsive to the contingencies of reinforcement. If the contingencies of reinforcement are stable, behavior will be stable. If the contingencies of reinforcement are consistent across situations, then behavior will be consistent across situations. If you want to predict what somebody's going to do in some situation, don't try to find that prediction in his or her personality traits. Look at the contingencies of reinforcement in that situation. Find out what's being rewarded and punished, and you'll know what the person is going to do. The idea behind these learning theory approaches to personality was that personality is something that's acquired over a history of learning. Okay, that you basically learn to be the kind of person you are because that is reinforced by your environment. There's very little role for things like genetics or biologically based individual differences in temperament in these theories of personality. And the idea here is that the reason personality is not as stable, not as consistent, not as predictable as we might have thought it is because personality is in constant change. Personality changes through social learning. You're always learning new behaviors. You're always learning to display new behaviors in various kinds of situations. And as you acquire these stimulus response contingencies, your personality changes accordingly. Put another way, whereas both the psychodynamic and the trait theories of personality argued that personality was established somehow, and once established, it kind of remained the way it was. These learning theories basically argued that personality is not given once and for all time. Personality is actively maintained through learning, and it is actively changed through learning. Now, if all this seems familiar to you, it's because it's behaviorism, right? This is what people like John B. Watson and B.S. Skinner and all these guys had to say, especially the radical behaviorism that was associated with Watson and Skinner, who basically argued that learning consisted of the establishment of connections between stimuli and responses by means of reinforcement, and that in order to understand what an organism, not just a person, but any organism did, all you had to do was to understand what stimulus-response connections were being reinforced. You didn't have to make any reference to mental events like motives or drives or anything like that. This idea about personality, this alternative idea about personality, was given a considerable expression by B.S. Skinner himself. This, I think, is the best portrait of Skinner there ever was. It makes him look like a wild visionary, which in fact he was. Actually, he wasn't so wild. He was a very calm guy, but his visions were wild. Looks a little bit like Bertrand Russell there, which I think is not a coincidence. But it was Skinner who gave us the doctrine of situationism that I talked about at the very beginning of the course. The idea that human behavior, like all other organisms' behavior, is under the control of various stimuli in the environment. And so Skinner, in his Lectures on Science and Human Behavior, which was the first time that Skinner really took the principles of behaviorism that he had applied in his studies of rats and pigeons and applied them to the human case, saying, look, the important variables in personality are not your defenses against anxiety, as Freud would have it. The important variables in personality are not your personality traits, as traditional trait theories would have it. All you got to know about a person is what his reinforcement history is, what he's been rewarded for doing in the past, what discriminative stimuli are present in the environment, and what the contingencies of reinforcement are that are present in the environment. Personality is maybe simple. Some individual's personality may be simple. Another individual's personality may be complex. But that complexity of personality doesn't reside within the person. The complexity of personality resides in the environment in which the person exists. People are complicated when stimulus conditions are complicated. People are complicated when their reinforcement histories are complicated. All the action is outside the individual. Arthur and Carolyn Stotts, that's them in the lab coats there in a picture from the, I'm afraid, the early 50s, the only picture I had of them, took this idea and applied it in a much more thoroughgoing way to problems of human personality than Skinner ever did. Skinner just kind of tossed these ideas off, but they applied Skinnerian principles to basic problems of human personality, human motivation, social behavior, and all sorts of things like that, and actually tried to establish learning theory as a unifying principle for psychology, including the science of personality. Now, the failures of psychodynamic theories of personality, and for that matter, psychodynamic theories of mental illness, and the apparent failure of trait theories of personality as well, gave rise to a whole number of trends in the latter part of the 20th century that led us to where we're going this week, to a cognitive approach to personality. Among these developments was the emergence of a new set of forms of psychotherapy for use in the treatment of mental illness, known as behavior therapy. Joseph Volpe, that's him in the glasses, that's he in the glasses, introduced a technique called systematic desensitization, which was intended to get rid of people's anxieties by basically putting them on an extinction regime. Ted Ayon and Nate Azrin, that's those guys up there, took essentially a Skinnerian idea to the treatment of chronic mental patients, people with schizophrenia who were hospitalized, and basically put them on what are known as token economies, in which they would get rewards for engaging in various kinds of adaptive behaviors. And these treatments actually worked, as opposed to the other treatments that were around clinical psychology at the time. And it was the success of these behavior therapies that led people to think that maybe there was something to this behavioristic notion of personality after all. If it could be used successfully in the treatment of something like mental illness, maybe it was the way to go in personality as well. But pretty quickly, all of this began to take a cognitive turn. Remember that in Skinnerian radical functional behaviorism, all you care about knowing is what stimuli are present and what responses are being made in the presence of those stimuli. There's no reference in radical functional behaviorism to things like intervening mental states. We don't care what the organism wants. We don't care what the organism likes. We don't care what the organism thinks. All we care about are what the correlation is between the stimulus and the response. But pretty quickly, with the coming of the cognitive revolution in experimental psychology, there came to pass a cognitive revolution in personality and clinical psychology as well. Two major leading figures in this were Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck. Tim Beck. This is Ellis, together at a conference once, but both Ellis and Beck, notice what the dates are, roughly at the same time, working quite independently of each other, began to inject cognitive considerations into our conceptualizations of mental illness. So, for example, Ellis began to develop what he called a rational emotive form of psychotherapy, in which people were encouraged to use their reasoning powers to get control of their emotional responses. Whenever Ellis would encounter a patient who said, "Oh, I'm so depressed," or whatever, he'd say, "Snap out of it. Just don't do that anymore. Get control of yourself. Think about it for a second. And when you think about it for a second, you'll realize the world isn't going to come to an end tomorrow. You're not as bad a person as you thought you were. Some people do like you, after all, and so on." And all of this was based on the idea that emotions are themselves a product of cognitive construction. That the way we feel in some situation is determined by the way we perceive and categorize that situation. So if we change the way we perceive and categorize the situation, our feelings will change accordingly. That's the whole idea behind rational emotive therapy. Tim Beck, introduced cognitive therapy as a formal term in the late 1960s and early 70s. Beck was, in fact, a trained psychoanalyst. You say something like this, it's like a trained circus lion or something like that. Trained psychoanalyst. He was deeply committed to psychoanalytic theory as a psychiatrist, but it just wasn't working out in his treatment of patients, and he began to argue for another approach. And of course, as you'll remember from an earlier discussion, Beck argued that people became depressed because of particular habits of thought. That is, people became depressed, or they were disposed to become depressed, because they had negative views of themselves, negative expectations for the future, and negative views of the world outside. And he argued that a therapist ought to try to change those perceptions and if we change those perceptions successfully, the person would come out of depression. Whereas Volpe and Ion and Azrin led to the development of the formation of the Association for the Advancement of Behavior Therapy, founded in 1967. Very quickly, within 15 years, the association had changed its name to the Association of Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, marking the triumph of the cognitive point of view in psychotherapy over a strict behavioral point of view. Something similar, a similar cognitive turn, occurs in personality theory, largely inspired by these cognitive turns that were happening in psychology as a whole. In the 1940s and 1950s, Neil Miller and John Dollard, Miller's a psychologist, recently deceased, John Dollard was a sociologist working at Yale at the Institute of Human Relations, tried to translate Freudian psychoanalytic theory of personality into the language of learning theory. They had the insight that Freud's theory was essentially a learning theory, that the infant had certain kinds of needs which it tried to satisfy, and by virtue of its actions in satisfying these needs came into conflict with outside forces, and so it learned to do something else to try to satisfy those needs. That's probably not the best way to think about Freudian theory. It's not nearly as interesting as Freud's own formulation, but that's what they did. They basically tried to translate Freudian learning theory into something that was, in their view, more scientifically respectable. But you can see in their social learning theory of personality the influence of behaviorism and other aspects of learning theory. The general idea was that personality is not a dynamic system of motives and defenses, like Freud would have said. Personality isn't a collection of traits, like the trait theorists would argue, but rather the personality really is a system of habits, a set of habitual social behaviors that are acquired through various learning processes, learning that occurs in a social context, learning where the cues and the reinforcements are delivered by other people, hence the name social learning theory. And as I said, Miller and Dollard's basic exercise was to translate Freudian theory into the language of learning theory, and it's from Miller and Dollard that we get this idea that the fundamental conflicts in human existence are not between sex and social structures or aggression and the idea that you might get beat up or whatever, but rather conflict comes in two forms: approach conflict, where you want to approach two goals, but you have to choose between two goals, and approach avoidance conflict, where you want to approach something that's going to result in harm. And they worked out ways in which organisms, from rats to humans, dealt with these kinds of conflicts. We're going to skip this, okay? Because and get right to the critique of classical social learning theory, which was first that it relied too much on animal models. Dollard was a sociologist. He did an important early study of racial integration and racial segregation in the American South, but basically he relied on Miller's experimental work, which was basically work on rats. Miller and Dollard also relied excessively on a particular version of learning theory known as Hullian learning theory. It was proposed by Clark Hull, who was in fact the director of the Institute for Human Relations at Yale. It's probably why they relied on his theory, because he was writing their salary checks. And Hullian learning theory began to fall apart in the early 1950s, and Hull was a really interesting guy, but his learning theory just didn't make it. But the important thing about Miller and Dollard's social learning theory, which was that for the very first time, personality psychology, which had heretofore kind of been segregated and really not discussed very much by experimental psychologists, was brought under the umbrella of general experimental psychology, and people began to think that, oh, we can understand personality in the same language that we use to understand other aspects of mind and behavior, and we can do experiments on personality that are like the experiments we do on other aspects of mind and behavior. So what happened then was that people gradually began to expand on classical social learning theory, and especially to push it in a more or less clear cognitive direction. Probably the first to do this was Julian Roeder, who was at this time at Ohio State University. He ended his career at the University of Connecticut, who tried to understand personality in terms of what you might call a fusion of two different learning theories. The learning theory of Hull, which was based on ideas of drive and drive reduction. We learned to engage in behaviors that make us less hungry, less thirsty, more safe, less pain. And the work of Berkeley's own Edward Tolman, who argued that what happens in learning was that the organism acquires expectations of what's going to happen following various kinds of cues, or expectations of what's going to happen when the organism engages in various kinds of responses. Roeder captured all of this in a piece of pseudo-mathematics that will look a lot like Lewin's grand truism. Again, something that we talked about at the very beginning of class. Lewin argued that behavior is a function of the person and the environment. Okay. Roeder argued that behavior potential, that is the likelihood of behavior, is thinking probabilistically here, is really a function of the organism's expectancies of reinforcement and the value that the organism attaches to that reinforcement. Notice what a departure this is from the functional the behaviorism of people like B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner said, if you want to understand what an organism does, all you have to understand are the contingencies of reinforcement. What stimulus response connections are being reinforced in the environment. All the actions outside the organism. The stimuli are outside the organism, the reinforcements occur from outside the organism, and the contingencies between them are something that occur outside the organism. But Roeder said, no, there's a lot of interesting stuff that's going on inside the organism's head. Now, Roeder was mostly interested in human beings, but he was very clear that at least as far as mammals were concerned, there were interesting things going on inside their heads too. It's not the probability of reinforcement that controls behavior. That's something that's in the situation. It's the expectancy of reinforcement, something that's in the head of the organism. And the organism's expectancy of reinforcement may be very different from the objective probability of reinforcement. And it's not whether some behavior is going to be rewarded or punished or something like that determines behavior. It's the value of the reinforcement to the organism. Again, reward and punishment is something we can think of objectively as a characteristic of the reinforcing event, but the value of the reinforcement is something that belongs inside the individual. Food may be thought of as a reward, but if you don't want food, it's not rewarded. Okay? Shock may be thought of as a punishment, but if you really like to be shocked, okay, then it's a reward, right? It's not value you have to take into consideration. You can't simply take into consideration how things are arranged in the external world. So again,